Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're starting with something we can all relate to: sleep. Or, to be more precise, how people in the Middle Ages slept, which, as it turns out, is far weirder and more fascinating than most of us could ever imagine. So before you get too comfortable and start nodding off, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you're genuinely enjoying what we do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see our global community coming together. All right, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, ambient hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ever find yourself staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., your mind racing, a sense of panic creeping in because you're supposed to be asleep? You might check your phone, calculate how many hours you have left before the alarm goes off, and curse the fact that you can't just get your 8 uninterrupted hours. We've all been there. But what if I told you that for our medieval ancestors, waking up in the dead of night wasn't a sign of failure or insomnia? It was the plan all along. Long before the glow of electricity, the endless scroll of TikTok, and the rise of sleep hygiene influencers, people in the medieval world approached nighttime with a schedule that would absolutely baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, or bimodal sleep, a natural, 2-part cycle that was split neatly in half, like a stale medieval biscuit. This wasn't some niche practice for insomniacs. It was the default setting for human sleep for thousands of years. And for the people of the Middle Ages, it was as normal as the rising sun. The routine was beautifully simple. After sundown, as the world fell into darkness and the chill of the night began to set in, most people turned in early. There wasn't much else to do. They would drift off into what was known as the first sleep. This initial slumber would last for about 4 hours, a deep, restorative rest that carried them to around midnight. But then, something strange would happen. They would wake up. Deliberately, this wasn't a groggy, confused awakening. It was an expected, structured part of the night. This waking period, which historians call the watch, would last for an hour or two. And during this time, people would engage in what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered a sleep disorder. It was just how sleep worked. The watch was seen as a practical, useful, and occasionally an alarmingly social window of time. So, what were they doing in the middle of the night? Well, pretty much everything. For the devout, this was the perfect time for quiet prayer and religious contemplation. The world was still, the distractions of the day were gone, and it was an intimate time to connect with God. For those who could read, which was a luxury, this was a chance to study religious texts by the faint light of a candle or the embers of the hearth. On a more practical level, this was the time to tend to the fire, a crucial task to keep the house from freezing. It was a chance to check on the livestock, because nothing ruins your REM cycle like waking up at dawn to discover your only goat has wandered off. People would mend clothes, think about the day to come, or just sit in quiet reflection. And yes, this was also considered the absolute ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals are surprisingly consistent on this point. They noted that after the first sleep, the body was well rested, the mind was calm, and digestion from the evening meal was complete. It sounds like a very polite, medieval way of saying everyone was too tired to argue and just relaxed enough to get on with it. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just remember that your ancestors were setting the bar very, very differently. After this productive interlude, people would simply go back to bed for their second sleep, which would last until sunrise. Everyone from monks and farmers to merchants and nobles participated in this nightly rhythm. It was so commonplace that it appeared casually in literature. The famous writer Chaucer, for instance, mentions it in the Canterbury Tales as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Which means that yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about their weird sleep schedules. What is truly fascinating is that modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be our brain's natural preference. Studies have shown that when humans are removed from artificial light, our bodies and circadian rhythms often revert to this two-part sleep cycle. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Don't reach for your phone. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah, yes, the watch has begun." And maybe go tend to a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of gas lamps, factories, and a growing cultural anxiety about unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. Sleep became something to be conquered, a timed sport where waking up was a sign of weakness. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure. It was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. All right, let's talk about beds. Or, to be more accurate, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is firm enough to support our backs, but soft enough to feel like a cloud. We have a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to ensuring our slumber is as comfortable and restorative as possible. This did not dramatically change the sleep experience. It was still a lumpy bag of straw, but it did offer a few key advantages. Most people simply slept in the same clothes they had worn all day, a simple tunic or shift. This saved time and provided an extra layer of warmth. You didn't just inherit land or a title. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed, a prized family heirloom. For most medieval folks, however, a bed wasn't a place of luxurious comfort. It was a place to not freeze to death, to avoid the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of one day being rich enough to sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle every time you moved. And they didn't sleep alone. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent, and occasionally a visiting cousin all slept together in the same space. Sometimes this meant sharing the same large straw pile, a communal heap of warmth and humanity. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. If you got cold, you huddled closer. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist in the same way it does today. First, it reduced the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear, just slightly. It also provided a bit of distance from the drafts that swept across the floor, and any small animals that might be wandering around at night. The frame itself was basic, often just a few planks of wood nailed together, with ropes or leather straps stretched across to support the pallet. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. Comfort was a luxury few could afford, and for most, the primary function of a bed was simply to not be the floor. A noble's bed was a status symbol, a piece of furniture so valuable and ornate that it was often the most expensive item in the entire household. These were massive, four-poster beds made from carved wood, featuring intricate designs and family crests. Instead of straw, their mattresses were stuffed with feathers, goose down, or wool, making them significantly softer and warmer. They slept on embroidered sheets made of fine linen and were surrounded by heavy curtains or canopies. These canopies weren't just for decoration. They served a practical purpose. They kept out the cold drafts that even a stone castle couldn't entirely prevent, and they offered a modicum of privacy. And hopefully, they helped keep out the lice, though even the richest households weren't entirely immune to pests. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the farmers, the laborers, the bed was a humble affair. The typical setup consisted of a straw mattress, often known as a pallet. This was quite literally just straw, hay, or even dried leaves stuffed into a large sack made of rough, coarse fabric like burlap or canvas. That is, if they had the luxury of a sack. For many of the poorest, It wasn't a mattress at all, but simply a pile of loose straw on the dirt or stone floor of their one-room hut. This pile might be damp from the leaking thatch roof, and it was almost certainly already claimed by a cat, a few chickens, or a family of mice. These pallets were not comfortable. They were lumpy, scratchy, and had to be regularly fluffed or replaced as the straw broke down and became compacted. But they were significantly better than the alternative, which was nothing. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and a surprisingly effective insulator against the cold. DAMP ground, which could literally sap the life out of you overnight. However, straw was also great at harboring a whole ecosystem of unwelcome guests. It was a 5-star hotel for insects, lice, fleas, and the occasional field mouse. This made sleeping an exercise in cautious stillness. If something itched, you tried to ignore it. If it bit you, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. The idea of changing sheets was, for most, a distant fantasy. Bed linens, if they existed at all, were a rare treat reserved for the wealthy. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back and some woodworking skills, they might elevate this straw mattress onto a simple wooden frame. Pajamas weren't really a thing for the common folk, and neither was the concept of personal space. Of course, the nobility had a completely different experience. These beds were so precious that they were often passed down in wills. When we hear the term nightcap today, we probably think of a cozy little drink before bed, maybe a splash of whiskey, a glass of warm milk, or a calming herbal tea. It's a ritual to wind down, something to sip by a warm fire while contemplating a questionable life decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, and often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. It was less about relaxation and more about basic survival. If you answered your door in the evening wearing your nightcap, it was a polite, unspoken medieval way of saying, "I am not dressed for conversation. And yes, this hat does mean go away." Picture Ebenezer Scrooge before his ghostly encounters, and you've got the general idea. For people in the Middle Ages, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were nothing less than your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep. They prepared to potentially die in their sleep. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. And with that, you are ready for a night filled with the final piece of the medieval sleep puzzle: pests. We'll get to those charming bedfellows in a bit. As a result, bedtime prayers were not just a comforting ritual. They were an essential piece of spiritual armor. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they didn't wake up in the morning. Sleepwear wasn't meant to be sexy or stylish. It was practical, often itchy, and occasionally flammable, given the proximity to open flames. It was the medieval equivalent of seeing someone in their bathrobe and slippers. The older version, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," is sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old, acknowledging that death is a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalog of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling particularly guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding under the bed, and one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged rather poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, like St. Christopher or St. Michael, who were seen as holy bouncers, guarding your soul at the nightclub of dreams. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong suit of medieval architecture. Stone walls, while sturdy, were terrible at retaining heat. Drafty thatched roofs and windows made of thin, stretched animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much to fend off the biting cold of a European winter. So you had better say your prayers. Not because it was comforting, But because hell was a very real and terrifying prospect, and you didn't want to show up at the gates of the afterlife uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. In some regions and time periods, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, and yes, that included while they were asleep. The cap itself could be a subtle indicator of wealth or status. A simple, undyed linen cap might belong to a peasant, while a wealthy merchant's wife might wear one embroidered with thread or dyed with expensive colors. Because nothing says, "I've made it quite like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull." Central heating? That was called a dog, or if you were lucky, a pig sleeping in the corner. Since a significant amount of body heat escapes through the scalp, medieval people, ever practical, adopted the humble nightcap to conserve every precious degree of warmth. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version is the one we often see in illustrations and old cartoons. Long, floppy, and pointed sometimes with a tassel on the end, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool or linen, or whatever scrap of warm fabric could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, the nightcap was a purely practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or a head wrap, which served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that likely hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond simple warmth, nightcaps also carried social and cultural weight. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose-fitting tunics that reached the knees or ankles. Now, let's move on from headwear to prayers. The logic was simple and terrifying. You could die at any moment from a sudden illness, a house fire, a demon hiding in the rafters, or, most dangerously, from being over the age of 30 in the year 1247. One of the most famous children's prayers, "Now I lay me down to sleep," has its roots in this mindset. In short, prayer before sleep was less about finding peace and more about last-minute damage control. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a complete stranger is generally limited to a few specific, often uncomfortable situations. A red-eye flight, an overly ambitious camping trip, or perhaps a bizarre Airbnb mix-up. We value our personal space, our privacy, and the security of knowing who is in the room with us. But in medieval Europe, sharing a bed with strangers wasn't just common. It was completely normal, and for many, not at all optional. Privacy was a luxury, not a right. Let's paint a picture. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim on your way to a holy shrine, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You've been on the road all day, you're exhausted, and you finally find an inn, a rare luxury in itself. You ask the innkeeper for a place to sleep. What you get is not your own room. It's not even your own bed. It's not even a particularly clean spot on the floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. The concept of a private room with a single bed was almost unheard of, reserved only for the wealthiest nobles who could afford to book the entire space. For everyone else, the goal was efficiency. If a bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, have a suspicious number of boils, or try to steal your purse. This wasn't considered rude or intrusive. It was just an efficient use of resources. A large bed could host 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on its size and the general level of social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with long rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged, and elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes inns would try to separate men and women, but not always. Some establishments even attempted to assign beds by profession, putting blacksmiths with other blacksmiths, clergy with other clergy, and allegedly thieves with other thieves, just to keep things organized. But more often than not, it was first come, first sprawled. While this might sound like a gerophobe's worst nightmare, back then it was a significant upgrade from the alternative, sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Being inside, with a roof over your head and a warm body next to you, was a form of security. Of course, this arrangement came with its own set of risks. Worried about theft, many travelers slept with their purse tied securely to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others would sleep on top of their bundles of goods, turning their luggage into both a pillow and a makeshift alarm system. If someone tried to move your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up significantly poorer. The rich, of course, did not have to suffer this fate. Nobles and wealthy merchants often traveled with their own entourage, including servants who would secure them the best accommodations. They might demand their own private rooms, and an innkeeper who valued their roof would be wise to oblige. For everyone else, though, the communal bed was the standard. This communal approach to sleep wasn't just for travelers. Within the home, sleeping alone was also highly unusual. As we've discussed, families slept together for warmth and security. But beyond that, there was a deep-seated cultural belief that sleeping alone was, well, a bit weird. It was considered impractical, lonely, and even spiritually suspicious. In a world where the night was believed to be filled with demons, ghosts, and other malevolent spirits, being alone in the dark made you vulnerable. Having others nearby created a kind of moral and physical buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least there would be a witness, or perhaps the demon would get your snoring cousin first. For children, being left alone at night was practically unthinkable. Bedtime stories weren't just about fluffy bunnies. They were often cautionary tales about what happened to those who wandered off or slept alone. These stories didn't end in hugs. They ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with more than just each other. It was common for young children or even servants to sleep in the same room, sometimes on a smaller pallet at the foot of the main bed. The idea of a master bedroom as a private sanctuary was a much later invention. In fact, the image of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed would have seemed incredibly foreign and wasteful to a medieval mindset. In some religious contexts, like monasteries, sleeping alone was actually used as a form of punishment. Solitary confinement in a cell was seen as a way to isolate a monk from the community and force them to confront their sins. The medieval logic was clear. Group sleep meant public accountability and safety, while solitary sleep granted the opportunity for sin and vulnerability. So the next time you're curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like a goat, take a moment to enjoy the silence and solitude. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought to yourself, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory. The beds were usually arranged in neat rows, like morally upright sardines. And when we say beds, the term is used loosely. They were often just wooden planks, sometimes with a thin straw mattress on top if the abbot was feeling particularly generous, or if it was a major feast day. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty, but out of sheer practicality. While monks were sleeping in austere dormitories, knights and soldiers on campaign faced their own unique set of bedtime challenges. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. There is nothing quite like waking up to the sound of charging hooves and having to suit up, while you are still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might sleep with their swords or axes right at their side, like very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in a gambeson, a thick, quilted jacket that offered a bit of protection from a surprise attack, and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else in the camp woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived. Again, whether you were a monk seeking salvation or a knight seeking survival, sleep in the Middle Ages was rarely a peaceful escape. It was just another part of the daily struggle. Shields often doubled as pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to waste time getting dressed. Priorities. It's just not practical. However, during wartime, on a military campaign, or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered a wise and necessary precaution. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a nasty habit of pinching skin. Add to that the cold stone floor's minimal bedding and the ambient sounds of snoring, comrades' crackling torches, and the occasional wounded soldier. And you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below an airport terminal on the comfort scale. Comfort was optional. Survival was highly recommended. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Getting dressed in the pitch dark at 2:00 a.m. for the first prayer service was far more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, the robe, belt, and sometimes even the sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and very poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up with an extra cloak. If you got hot, well, you didn't. That wasn't really an option. This was a place where comfort went to die, quietly, under a vow of silence. Silence was not just suggested. It was strictly enforced under the rule of St. Benedict. You didn't need to see. You just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the primary goal of monastic sleep. Despite the incredible austerity, monks believed that their Spartan beds were a form of spiritual training. They were preparing for the afterlife by denying the body any excess comfort. Sleep was not a luxury to be enjoyed, but a necessity to be monitored and scheduled, just like everything else in their highly regimented lives. Some monks, particularly in stricter orders, even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxury, pleasant dreams, or, for that matter, good circulation. Compared to this, the peasant's straw pile with its snoring pigs almost seems luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you for your worldly thoughts. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a theological gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive enough to wake your brothers, the Lord might still hold you accountable. Or at least your cellmates would. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, really. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a tightly scheduled necessity, and the conditions were designed to be as austere as possible to train the soul and deny the flesh. The typical monastic dormitory, or dorter, housed dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single large room. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Lighting was minimal, perhaps one candle at the end of the hall, overseen by a designated monk. Now, let's shift from the holy to the martial. To be clear, most knights didn't regularly sleep in their full-plate armor. It was incredibly hot, heavy, and unbelievably loud. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt and perhaps his breastplate on, just in case the enemy decided to stage a midnight surprise party. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Even those not in the heat of battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. And lest we forget, armor wasn't exactly subtle. By the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and frozen fields. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were on a divine mission, building a holy community in the American wilderness, a city on a hill that was constantly being watched by God and, more terrifyingly, stalked by Satan. For them, the devil wasn't a metaphor. He was a real, active force in the world, always looking for a way to corrupt their godly society. Life in Salem was already hard, and the community was fraying at the edges. The village had recently split from the more prosperous Salem town over bitter disputes about politics, land, and religion. Recent crops had failed, threatening the food supply. A smallpox epidemic had ravaged nearby communities, and the constant threat of wars with Native American tribes had left many people traumatized and on edge. There was friction between neighbors, with simmering resentments over inheritance disputes and property lines. A deep-seated distrust of outsiders, or anyone who didn't quite fit the rigid Puritan mold, permeated the village. Add to this volatile mix the long, dark, and bitterly cold New England winter, which forced everyone indoors, amplifying the claustrophobia and anxiety. Something was bound to break. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's controversial minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They would scream uncontrollably for no apparent reason. They threw things across the room in violent fits. They contorted their bodies into unnatural, painful-looking positions. At times, they would fall silent for hours, their eyes wide with a terror that no one else could see. The girls claimed they were being pinched, bitten, and pricked by invisible forces. Neighbors whispered that the girls were cursed, that something unnatural was at work. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do and likely fearing that this strange affliction would damage his already precarious standing in the community, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After a thorough examination, Griggs failed to find any physical cause for the girls' bizarre symptoms. So he delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word, witchcraft, was like a match thrown on dry tinder. It set fire to all the fears and anxieties that were already simmering just beneath the surface of Salem life. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched at all. In fact, it was an explanation that made a terrifying kind of sense to the Puritan mind. And if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, a place that should have been a bastion of piety, what did that mean for the rest of the community? No one was safe, prodded by the concerned and increasingly frightened adults. Around them, the girls began to name names. At first, they accused women who were already on the margins of society's social misfits, the poor, the unpopular. But soon, the accusations would spread, reaching the respectable, the wealthy, and even the most pious members of the church. Salem was a small, insular village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark of a cold winter would soon become cries from the gallows, leaving behind a legacy of paranoia, injustice, and fear that still haunts America's history books to this day. The fuse had been lit, and the Salem witch trials had begun. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in the fertile ground of Salem's collective anxiety, it spread like a suffocating vine, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like the influential Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis seemed to grow bolder and more theatrical with each passing day. Their fits became public performances. They would convulse in the middle of church services, scream during prayers, and claim they could see dark spirits and specters hovering over certain villagers. This wasn't just dismissed as childhood imagination. It was dramatic, public, and most disturbingly, it was believed. The first to be accused were those with the least social protection, women who already lived on the fringes of Puritan society. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar known for muttering to herself when she was turned away from doorsteps. People claimed her mumbling wasn't just grumbling. It was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at children, and she didn't conform to the quiet, submissive ideal of a Puritan woman. She fit the mold of a witch precisely because she didn't fit the mold of Salem. Then there was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who hadn't attended church in over a year due to illness. She had also scandalized the community by attempting to disinherit the children from her first marriage and instead leave her property to her new husband, an indentured servant she had married. A woman who defied both religious and social conventions was clearly suspect. The third initial accused was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household. Originating from Barbados, her different cultural background, her storytelling, and her folklore were seen as exotic and frightening by the villagers. She was an outsider in every sense of the word, under immense pressure and likely physical beatings from Reverend Parris. Tituba confessed to witchcraft, but instead of clearing the air and closing the case, her confession blew the whole thing wide open. She didn't just confess. She spun a terrifying and elaborate tale. She told of a tall man in black, a figure universally associated with the devil, who came to her and asked her to sign his book. She described seeing strange animals, a yellow bird, a red cat, and even spectral dogs that served as familiars for the witches. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem working alongside her. She said she had seen their names in the devil's book. That was all the court magistrates needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door to a wider conspiracy, others rushed through it. The accusations began to multiply. New names were added to the list weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors, using the hysteria as a cover to settle old scores. Long-standing grudges over land, money, or social status were suddenly disguised as righteous accusations of witchcraft. If a farmer's cow suddenly died, it must have been bewitched by the neighbor he had argued with last month. If a baby cried inconsolably during a prayer, surely that was the devil's work, brought on by the strange old woman who lived down the lane. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out. To defend an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon yourself. If you questioned the girl's testimony, you were clearly trying to protect the devil's servants, which probably meant you were one of them. Silence became the only form of safety. And so, the web of accusations widened, trapping the entire village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading fast. Hysteria was now in control. As the accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch, a colonial government had to step in. Governor William Phipps, who had only recently been appointed and was eager to assert his authority and maintain order, established a special court to deal with the escalating chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a name derived from Old French meaning to hear and to determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules of evidence were warped by panic. Instead of requiring hard, verifiable proof, it allowed something far more insidious and dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony from a victim claiming that the spirit or specter of the accused person had appeared to them and caused them harm, pinching, choking, or tormenting them in their dreams. In other words, if one of the afflicted girls claimed to have seen your ghost-like form choking them in the night, that was considered admissible evidence in a court of law. It didn't matter that the accused person could have been miles away, or even asleep in their own bed. It was their spirit, their malevolent astral projection, that was doing the devil's work. You couldn't cross-examine a dream. You couldn't disprove a vision. It was the ultimate unfalsifiable claim, and it gave the accusers terrifying power. The girls were now treated as star witnesses, and their seizures, screams, and gasps in the courtroom became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If the prisoner looked at her, she would shriek in agony. If they didn't look at her, she would shriek even louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewall and the unyielding Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all as proof of witchcraft. In these trials, there were no defense lawyers. The concept didn't exist yet in colonial courts. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls in the courtroom would writhe in agony, seemingly tormented by your defiant spirit. If you confessed, you might be spared execution, but only if you named other witches. The system was designed to reward lies and punish silence. The trials themselves became grim public spectacles. People traveled from nearby towns to witness the proceedings. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, impoverished, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking it. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused. But few dared to speak up openly. To question the court was to question the will of God. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a dark mirror, reflecting not justice, but fear. On June 10, 1692, the gallows on a barren, windswept patch of earth just outside Salem town, known as Gallows Hill, claimed its first victim. Her name was Bridget Bishop, and she was not new to scandal. Her reputation had already made her an easy target. She wore bright red clothing, which was considered scandalously flashy by Puritan standards. She ran a tavern where people drank and played games, and she had a sharp tongue. She had even been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though the charges were dropped. During her trial, neighbors came forward with a flood of spectral evidence and local gossip. They testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, that their babies fell ill after she passed by, and that they had found poppets, small dolls used for dark magic, in the walls of her home. Bridget Bishop denied everything, proclaiming her innocence to the very end. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to the gallows. No prayer was offered for her soul, and no mercy was shown. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched in. Grim silence, and with that single swift execution, the machinery of death began to churn. The hangings that followed came quickly, in a series of brutal public spectacles. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of these women had good standing in the church and community, which sent a chilling message. No one was safe. The case of Rebecca Nurse was particularly shocking. She was an elderly, pious, and well-respected woman, beloved in her community. Many of her neighbors signed a petition attesting to her good character. Even the jury initially found her not guilty. But under immense pressure from the court and the continued, frantic fits of the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. As she stood on the gallows, Rebecca Nurse's final words were whispered through the air like a haunting warning. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day of the trials, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a respectable church member who had made the fatal mistake of publicly doubting the trials from the beginning. Her skepticism made her a target, and she was soon accused and condemned. Her husband, Giles Corey, met a different but equally horrific fate. Giles was an 81-year-old farmer with a stubborn streak. When he was brought to trial, he refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. By remaining silent, he prevented the court from legally trying him. The court, unable to proceed, resorted to an ancient and brutal form of English punishment designed to force a plea, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Giles was laid on the ground. A wooden board was placed on his chest and over. The course of 3 days, heavy stones were piled on top of him, slowly and cruelly crushing the life out of him. His final words, as legend has it, were a defiant "more weight." By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 man had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in the squalid, disease-ridden jails while awaiting trial. Dozens more had confessed, often falsely, to save their own lives, and in doing so, implicated others. In total, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. The gallows cast long, dark shadows over Salem, not just on the hill where they stood, but in every home and every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold as the months wore on. The spell of hysteria finally began to crack, not because the court suddenly came to its senses, but because reality began to force its way back in. The turning point came when the accusations grew too bold and began to target people who were too powerful to be easily dismissed. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with some of the most influential families in the village. That was enough to condemn him. But on the day of his execution, as he stood on the gallows, Burroughs did something shocking. He flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish, something that witches were believed to be incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent. Some people wept. Even the most hardened observers were visibly shaken. But the execution went on. That moment, however, planted a powerful seed of doubt. Then came the accusation that broke the fever. Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself, was accused of witchcraft. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social ladder. Governor Phipps, already unnerved by the growing criticism and chaos, finally took decisive action. In October of 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted. Influential ministers, who had once been silent or even complicit, like Increase Mather, began to speak out, denouncing the use of spectral evidence. "It were better," Mather wrote, "that 10 suspected witches should escape than that 1 innocent person should be condemned." This was a radical thought in a society that had, for months, believed the exact opposite. People who had once cheered. The trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the public appetite for more blood had finally dulled. Too many respected figures were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was madness. The storm was breaking, but the damage was already done. The gallows fell. Silent, but Salem was a village left in ruins, haunted not by witches, but by guilt. Long before the godfathers of cinematic fame, Rome had its own original godmother of politics, a woman who wielded power with a finesse and ruthlessness that would have made even the most ambitious senators tremble. Her name was Fulvia, and her story is one of ambition, strategy, and unapologetic defiance in a world built and run by men. To understand Fulvia, you have to understand the Rome she was born into, a republic that was violently tearing itself apart. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the Fulvi family, an old and respected plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. While they weren't one of the ancient, blue-blooded patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced their fair share of consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a distinct taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus. Fulvius Bambalio was known more for his bumbling speech than for any significant political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammerer. She was born to command. From a very young age, Fulvia would have been immersed in the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators, generals, and magistrates would have debated policy and plotted strategy in her family's home. For the Roman elite, politics wasn't just something that happened in the Senate or the Forum. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. Elections, alliances, and betrayals were the stuff of dinner conversations. She would have seen firsthand how power wasn't just won on the battlefield, but in strategic marriages, public funerals, whispered rumors, and shadowy backroom deals dot in elite Roman households. Women were expected to be quiet, dignified partners. They were to be refined, educated, and above all, obedient. Their influence was meant to be subtle, exercised from behind the scenes. Fulvia would shatter every one of those expectations. She was born into wealth, she was highly educated, and she was exceptionally well connected. And she knew it. While the details of her early life remain hazy in the historical record, her later actions paint a picture of a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid. This was not someone who was content to fade into the background. She possessed a formidable personality, a sharp political mind, and an iron will to act, even in the fiercely male-dominated arena of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Roman Republic was unraveling. The old rules that had governed society for centuries were collapsing under the weight of civil wars, populist revolts, and the titanic power struggles between larger-than-life generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. Rome had become a pressure cooker of ambition and violence. Fulvia came of age right in the middle of this chaos. But rather than recoil from it, she learned to use it. Her upbringing didn't produce the kind of modest, retiring matron that Roman society idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 of the most powerful and radical men in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry into power. She would command it. She would lead revolts, finance armies, and become the first Roman woman ever to appear on a coin not as a goddess or a symbol, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was more than ready for Rome. Her story begins not with a quiet entry into society, but with a marriage that was as explosive as the time she lived in. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but a conventional Roman union. Clodius was no ordinary, stuffy nobleman. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and mobilizing. The power of the streets. To many members of the Roman elite, he was a dangerous demagogue, a threat to the established order. But to the masses, the poor, the disenfranchised, the working people of Rome, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a perfect strategic opportunity. Their marriage, which took place sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia's wealth and political connections with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. In a city that prized decorum, he reveled in shock value. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate the Bona Dea, a sacred female-only religious ceremony that was being held in Julius Caesar's home. The scandal was immense, but it only seemed to boost his popularity with the common people. He later took the unprecedented step of renouncing his patrician status and getting himself adopted into a plebeian family so that he could run for the office of tribune of the plebs. This position, designed to protect the common people, gave him immense power, including the ability to veto the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than almost anyone. And Fulvia, far from being a passive background consort, was right there beside him, learning and participating. Roman sources, though often hostile to her, suggest that Fulvia was an active and influential partner in her husband's political world. She wasn't just a silent supporter. She was a co-conspirator. She engaged with his supporters, was a visible presence during his public appearances, and managed their household as a bustling hub for Claudius's political machine. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But their alliance and Claudius's life came to a violent end in 52 BCE. Claudius was murdered on the Appian Way, ambushed by the bodyguards of his bitter political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, but Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly behind closed doors. In her first major political act, she staged a funeral that historians still talk about today. She brought Claudius's mutilated body into the public square, parading it through the Roman Forum with his bloodied wounds exposed for all to see. The effect was electric. The public was horrified, then enraged. Riots erupted across the city. Fulvia had turned her personal grief into a potent political weapon. An angry mob, incited by her display, carried Claudius's body into the Senate house itself and used the building's wooden furniture to create a funeral pyre, burning the entire structure to the ground. Fulvia had successfully manipulated public emotion and used spectacle as a political strategy. Claudius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of his shadow. Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In the volatile world of Roman politics, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Claudius, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate and effective supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed like an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama. But beneath the bravado was a sharp and cunning political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence. During one of Rome's most volatile periods, as the Republic teetered on the brink of civil war between Caesar and the Senate, led by Pompey, for Fulvia, this was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated political alliance. With Claudius gone, she needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built, and crucially, someone who had the backing of the most powerful man in Rome, Julius Caesar. Curio fit both bills perfectly. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the shifting power dynamics of the city. She didn't just marry into Caesar's movement. She helped shape it. She ensured that Claudius's network of supporters and street gangs stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged on Caesar's behalf. But the Roman world was collapsing into open conflict. The tensions between Caesar and Pompey finally exploded into civil war. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved, reportedly helping to organize support and manage resources for her husband's military campaign. In 49 BCE, Caesar sent Curio on a military expedition to Africa to secure the province. But it was a disaster. Curio was ambushed and killed by forces loyal to Pompey. His army was annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was a widow. And once again, Rome waited to see if she would finally fade into the background. She didn't. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political survivor with a dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's brutal civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist causes aligned with Caesar. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. She would soon marry the man who would become Caesar's political heir, and together they would challenge the very foundations of the Republic. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious, charismatic, and battle-hardened general who was Julius Caesar's loyal right-hand man. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a merger of political power. Fulvia had already proven herself to be a master of Roman street politics, capable of mobilizing mobs and shaping public opinion. Antony, who was rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy, ruthless support. In the capital, together, they formed one of the most politically potent and feared couples of the late Roman Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and had outmaneuvered countless political enemies. Antony, for his part, was no stranger to scandal. He drank heavily, he gambled recklessly, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But in Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than just entertain him. He had found a partner who could defend his interests, hold his political alliances together, and rally his supporters when he was away on military campaigns. And Antony, despite his brash and often impulsive exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a level of public authority that no Roman woman had ever wielded before. She managed his finances, she opened his correspondence, she issued orders in his absence, and she sat in on high-level political meetings, influencing appointments and strategy. Roman sources, which were mostly written by their political enemies, depicted her as overbearing, power-hungry, and masculine. But what truly disturbed them wasn't just her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language or category for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony immediately rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But while he was maneuvering in the Senate and preparing for war, it was Fulvia who held the city of Rome itself. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate, with Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his de facto representative in the capital. She managed patronage networks, coordinated with the veteran soldiers and street gangs loyal to Antony, and ensured that his supporters remained mobilized and his enemies remained intimidated. She even helped to arrange Antony's official, if temporary, reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her own daughter, Clodia, to him a political alliance that would later implode spectacularly. In a move that was completely unprecedented. Fulvia's image began to appear on Roman coins alongside Antony's. She was not depicted as a goddess or a symbolic figure, but as herself, a clear and public acknowledgement of her political status. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full, blinding glare. But power in Rome was always a borrowed and dangerous commodity. And Fulvia was about to test the absolute limits of how far a woman could go before Rome, and its powerful men snapped back. In 41 BCE, with her husband Mark Antony stationed in the east, entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war, not just with words or political maneuvering, but with legions and swords. She went to war against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. The conflict, which became known as the Parisine War, was a military rebellion led and organized by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history such a thing would happen. The official cause of the war was Octavian's controversial program of land redistribution, which was displacing many Italian farmers to reward his own soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy. She argued that he was cheating Antony's veterans out of the land they were promised, with Antony's younger brother, Lucius Antonius, serving as her frontman and co-consul. Fulvia raised an astonishing 8 legions. They marched through Italy, rallying support, and eventually seized the fortified city of Perusia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, while Lucius was the official face of the rebellion, ancient sources are clear that this was Fulvia's war. They suggest she was far more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, she stirred up public outrage, and she even corresponded with generals in the field. The city of Rome buzzed with shocking rumors of her commanding legions, issuing military orders, and forcing Lucius into confrontations he would have rather avoided. Octavian, though initially caught off guard, acted with the ruthless speed that would become his trademark. He laid siege to Perusia throughout the harsh winter of 4140 BCE, cutting off all supply lines and relentlessly hammering the city into submission. Trapped inside, Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food supplies and the political betrayal of allies who failed to come to her aid, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the starving city surrendered. Octavian, in a calculated move to avoid completely alienating Antony, spared Lucius's life, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, brokered marriages, and raised armies was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon, a city in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony, but Antony didn't come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever done before. She had waged a civil war. And now, the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished and alone, Fulvia's health began to fail. After enduring a brutal siege, a humiliating exile, and the sting of betrayal, she died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward, conveniently blaming the entire war on his deceased wife. As part of a renewed peace treaty, he agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia. The triumvirs were temporarily united once again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs on power, was gone. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was, and still is, no small feat, but planning one for over 100,000 people, and possibly more, in the politically charged climate of 1963, sounded like a recipe for disaster. Logistically, it was a nightmare. How do you manage food, water, and transportation for a crowd the size of a city? Where do you put the bathrooms? How do you set up sound systems powerful enough to reach 250,000 people? How do you ensure safety and control the crowd without provoking a confrontation? It seemed impossible. And yet somehow they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayar Rustin, a man who, despite being a brilliant strategist and a lifelong activist, was often kept behind the scenes for political reasons. Rustin was openly gay and had been a member of the Communist Party in his youth, 2 facts that his opponents, and even some of his allies, feared would be used to discredit the entire civil rights movement. But those who knew him understood that he was a master organizer, a logistical genius with an unwavering commitment to nonviolence. Rustin had studied nonviolent resistance directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had been arrested, beaten, jailed, and surveilled by the FBI for decades. But nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, peaceful protest could achieve when it was coordinated with military precision. In just 8 short weeks, Rustin and his small team transformed the idea of a march into a concrete reality. They worked out of a cramped office in Harlem, with phones ringing off the hook and volunteers streaming in and out. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and that title was deliberately chosen. Rustin and the march's elder statesman, a Philip Randolph, framed the event to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. This dual message was no accident. While Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the march's official demands were just as much about ending unemployment, raising the minimum wage, and protecting workers' rights as they were about ending segregation. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, a white backlash, or worse, bloodshed in the nation's capital. They tried to persuade the organizers to call it off. When that failed, civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the government prepared for the worst. The National Guard was put on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were told to prepare for mass casualties. Liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home to avoid the expected chaos. And then there was the question of unity within the movement itself. The Big Six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters often clashed over tactics and ideology. Some, like the NAACP, favored a more cautious, legalistic approach. Others, particularly the young firebrands of SNCC, were growing impatient with King's philosophy of nonviolence and wanted to take more radical, confrontational action. They felt that the older generation was too willing to compromise. But despite their differences, they all agreed on one thing. The time for silence had passed. Rustin's meticulous plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train coming into the city was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. Every route to the Lincoln Memorial had volunteer marshals who were trained in nonviolent crowd control. They even coordinated the preparation of 80,000 cheese sandwiches for the marchers. They weren't just planning a protest. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation and prove to a skeptical world that a mass movement for justice could be both powerful and peaceful. The dream was being built, one logistical detail at a time. August 28, 1963. A sweltering, humid Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the air was thick, clinging to the skin like a second shirt. But the oppressive heat didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. They were black, they were white, they were young, they were old. They were students, clergy, factory workers, domestic workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best starched shirts and polished shoes as a sign of the solemnity of the occasion. Others clutched handmade protest signs with messages like, "We demand an end to police brutality now," and "We march for jobs for all." They came by bus, by train, by carpool, and some had even walked for hundreds of miles to be there. In total, over 250,000 people, far more than the organizers had even dared to hope for, converged on the National Mall, creating a rising tide of hope that flowed between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. And yet, despite the government's palpable fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm, almost festive. There was no chaos. Volunteers, identifiable by their armbands, directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out cups of water. People gathered in groups, singing freedom songs like "We Shall Overcome," holding hands and cheering as new waves of marchers arrived to join them. You could hear gospel choirs rehearsing near the reflecting pool, and the steady, rhythmic chant of "Jobs and Freedom" echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined the throng, not to steal the spotlight, but to lend their support. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and a young Bob Dylan were all there, mingling with the crowd. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and to add their voices to a cause that was bigger than any single person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a powerful, shared understanding that this wasn't just another protest. This was a sacred moment. For many of the Black Americans in attendance, just standing on the National Mall, in the heart of the nation's capital, felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say we are here in front of the same Lincoln Memorial, where the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln sat enshrined in stone. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. This was the same city that, for decades, had been a symbol of their exclusion, a place where they couldn't eat at most lunch counters or stay in most hotels. Today, they were claiming it as their own dot at exactly noon. The official program began. The leaders of the movement took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, different ideologies, and different regions of the country, but all united in their core message. The speakers demanded an end to segregation, the passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, equal pay, the desegregation of schools, a living wage, and a stop to police brutality. The legendary gospel singer Mahalia Jackson sang, her powerful voice soaring over the crowd. Marian Anderson, another iconic singer who had once been banned from performing at the nearby Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for hundreds of thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed and the sun beat down, the tension grew not from a threat of unrest, but from a palpable sense of anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for, the moral voice of the movement, had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history. It was becoming a legend, minute by minute, speech by speech, song by song. By mid-afternoon, the vast crowd had grown quiet. They weren't tired. They were waiting. They knew what was coming. Standing in the symbolic shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire of righteous indignation building inside him. In his hand, he carried his prepared remarks, a speech that had been typed and collaboratively written with his advisors late into the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came directly from his soul. He began his speech with a measured, almost somber intensity. He laid out the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and the broken promises of American democracy. 100 years later, he said, his voice echoing across the mall, his words a direct reference to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell with the powerful cadence of a sermon, a rhythm he had perfected in countless pulpits across the South. He used repetition, rhythm, and strategic pauses, not as rhetorical tricks, but as instruments to conduct the emotions of the massive crowd. The people listened, rapt, some nodding in solemn agreement, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that would transform the tone of the entire event, and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind Dr. King was the gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung so powerfully earlier that day. As King was nearing the end of his prepared text, she suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And in that moment, something shifted. Dr. King acknowledged her call. He pushed his written notes aside, gripped the podium with both hands, looked out over the sea of faces, and launched into a passage he had delivered. In earlier speeches, but never with this much power, never on this grand a stage. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in, a collective breath held in anticipation. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Each phrase rang out louder, clearer, and more resolute than the last. His voice soared, no longer just speaking, but testifying. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today." It was no longer just a speech. It had become a vision, a prayer, a bolt of lightning that illuminated the very soul of America. He painted a picture of a future free from the shackles of hatred and injustice, a future where freedom and equality were not just abstract ideals, but a lived reality. By the time he reached his thundering conclusion, quoting the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. There was a roar of applause, tears of joy, and shouts of "Amen." The people gathered there knew they had just witnessed something far more profound than mere oratory. They had heard a prophecy, and in those few unforgettable minutes, Dr. King had not only given voice to the deepest aspirations of the civil rights movement, he had articulated a dream for America itself, a dream that would echo through history and inspire generations to come. The speech was over, but the dream had just begun. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America. It fundamentally reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious, high-stakes act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy permanently, altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the incredible power of collective action. In the immediate aftermath, the legislative victories weren't instantaneous, but the march had created an undeniable moral momentum that Congress and the President could no longer ignore not less than a year later. In July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had assumed the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, signed the landmark Civil Rights Act into law. This was one of the most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation in American history, outlawing segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And it didn't stop there. In 1965, after more marches, more protests, and more bloodshed in places like Selma, Alabama, the Voting Rights Act was passed, striking down the discriminatory practices like poll taxes and literacy tests that had been used for decades to keep Black Americans from voting. Would these historic bills have passed without the March on Washington? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure behind them? Almost certainly not. The march had shown the nation and the world that the demand for civil rights was not a fringe movement. It was a powerful, unified, and deeply moral cause. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech on that August day propelled him into a new realm. He went from being a respected national leader to a global icon, the face and voice of the struggle for human rights everywhere. He would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, but that fame came with a heavy cost. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, intensified its surveillance of him, viewing him as a dangerous radical. He faced constant death threats, and ultimately, his life was cut short by an assassin's bullet in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march proved what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale nonviolent mobilization, and it inspired a new generation of activists, both in the United States and around the world. anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model of peaceful, powerful resistance. But the legacy of the march isn't just confined to history books. The language of the march, the powerful idea of linking jobs and freedom, the indelible image of peaceful resistance, and the soaring echoes of "I have a dream" still pulse through modern protest movements. From the Million Man March in the 1990s to the Black Lives Matter rallies of today, the spirit of 1963 reverberates with every chant for justice and every cardboard sign held high. Today, in Washington, D.C., Dr. King's Memorial stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial, a towering likeness carved in stone with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't made of stone. It's found in classrooms where his speech is studied, in voting booths where rights he fought for are exercised, in marshes where his spirit is invoked, and in the voices of those who refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Because the dream wasn't meant to rest quietly in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us, more than 60 years later, to do just that. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to echo, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't simply a strange, isolated episode of mass hysteria. It was a complete breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers became complicit in a tragedy simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, which were meant to protect the innocent, became tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became theater, and silence became an admission of guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it all unfolded. In just a matter of months, fear completely overcame fact. Old grudges, disguised as spiritual warfare, became death sentences. It didn't take real demons or devils. It only took the belief in them. But the trials also taught hard-earned lessons that would ripple through American society for centuries. The Salem episode would be cited repeatedly in debates about due process and civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit the kinds of legal abuses that doomed the accused in Salem, guaranteeing rights like legal counsel, the right to face one's accusers, and the requirement for concrete evidence. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become a shorthand for any kind of political persecution or moral panic. But in truth, Salem wasn't a metaphor. It was a real town where real people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems that were designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear, when left unchecked, can become its own form of tyranny. And when that fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, becomes almost unstoppable,